As a story narrator who grew up in the small city of Merced in Central California, I've spent over 20 years surrounded by chilling tales of haunted houses shared by friends and family. Growing up on the rougher side of town, we didn't have much, but the houses were cheap and often haunted. In this video, I'll be sharing 8 eerie stories of haunted houses from Merced. Sit back and enjoy these spine-tingling tales. Story number 1. In 1994, my family and I lived in a house on the edge of a farm near the Merced Farmers Market. At the time, I was only 8 years old, and my younger brother Michael, who was 6, and I shared a room. We had a bunk bed, and since I was older, I slept on the bottom bunk. Some nights I would wake up because I kept hearing someone pacing around the room. Sometimes it sounded like someone was pacing and talking to themselves, as if they were very sad. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it sounded like they were speaking Spanish. Occasionally, I could see a shadow moving around the room. It was dark, but by the outline, it looked like the figure was wearing an oversized shirt. When I saw the figure pacing around near the window, where there was a bit of moonlight, I can see that the figure was wearing a red shirt. I told my parents about this, but they didn't believe me. One night, I woke up to the sound of a loud gunshot in my room. My brother Michael woke up too. We both heard the same thing. We turned on the light, but there was no one there. A moment later, we saw the light outside our room turn on, and my dad opened the door, asking what we were doing and what the noise was. My brother and I told him, we didn't know. We didn't know. My parents checked the house, but they didn't find anything. All the windows and doors were still locked, and no one had broken in. One evening, after the sun had just set, my mother was outside watering the garden in the backyard. She saw a young man in a red shirt walking just outside the yard. The young man was bleeding from the side of his head. Our backyard had a chain-link fence, so you could see beyond it, where there were tall, dry flower plants. My mother got scared and ran inside to tell my dad. When they both went back outside, the young man was gone. After my mother saw that, she and my father decided to move us out of the house. I don't know if someone shot themselves in our house. Maybe it happened in my room. The house was torn down in 2002, before they built all the new houses in that area. Story number 2. When I was in high school, my parents and I lived in a house on 19th and O Street. It was an old house on the corner by the stop signs, and it was one of the strangest houses we had ever lived in. I remember one day my mom picked me up from school and dropped me off at home before going to pick up my sister from Golden Valley High School. I went inside our house and started eating when someone knocked on the door. I opened it to find a man standing outside. He and his family had lived in the house before us and had just moved out about a month ago. I handed him some mails that belongs to him and his family. Then he asked if my parents were home. I was the only one there, but I lied and said my dad was home but in the bathroom. The man told me he was leaving, but he asked me to tell my dad that in this house, our souls tend to not stay with our bodies. Whatever that even mean, he said my dad would understand. I guess it's a cultural or religious beliefs. Then the man went back to his car and drove off. I didn't know what he meant, and when my mom and sister got home, I told them about the man, but they didn't understand either. The following week, I was playing video games in the living room with the window open. At sunset, my dad was in the backyard, digging a spot for my mom to plant some herbs. It was getting dark when I heard my dad call from outside through the window. "Tony, bring me a flashlight. It's getting dark." I got up, grabbed the flashlight, and took it outside. But when I shined the light around, I couldn't find him. I checked the front yard too, but he wasn't there. When I came back inside, I realized my parents had just gotten out of the shower. I was scared, so I told my dad, but he brushed it off and told me to close the window and turn down the volume on my video game. I wasn't sure if my dad was scared too, or if he just didn't care. One night, I was playing video games again. My parents were in bed with my 6-year-old brother, and my sister was outside the front door with her boyfriend. Around 10 p.m., my sister knocked on the door and I told her it wasn't locked. She kept knocking, so I said it again, but she kept on, so I got up to open it. When I did, it was her, and I told her the door hadn't been locked. She just walked past me without saying anything and went to her room. I figured she and her boyfriend must have had an argument or something. At 11 p.m., someone knocked on the door again. By then, I was the only one awake, and all the lights were off. I got up and saw my sister outside. I froze in fear. I wasn't sure if it was really her, or if the person I had let in earlier was even my sister. I opened the door, and my sister said, "I told you I was outside with my boyfriend in his car." "Why did you lock the door?" I told her I hadn't locked it earlier, and then I told her what had happened. This time, we were both scared. We checked her room, but no one was in there. We ended up sleeping in the living room that night. Another day, my mom dropped me off at Merced High School, then dropped my sister off at Golden Valley High, and went shopping at a store before heading home. When she got back, she heard me singing in my room. She thought I had ditched school, so she went to check, but I wasn't there. She got scared and went over to my aunt's house for the rest of the day until it was time to pick me up. We only lived in that house for a little over a month before we moved out. It was just too weird. Maybe the Hmong man was right. Living in that house was like our soul tend to not stay with our body. I'm not sure if it's our souls not sticking to our body, or maybe it's some kind of doppelgangers. I don't know. Story number 3. In 2006, I moved my family to a house near Tenaya Middle School in a rough part of town. For those who know the area, there's a lot of shooting in that neighborhood. My wife and I had a 2-year-old daughter named Daisy and an 8-month-old son. Right after we moved in, I noticed that Daisy had started talking a lot more, even when no one was talking to her. She'd carry on conversations as if she were speaking to someone. At 2 years old, she only knew a high some words, and her speech wasn't that clear yet. I knew that kids around that age tend to babble and talk to their toys, so I didn't think much of it, but I did notice that she had named her Snow White doll Emma. Strangely, she could say Emma very clearly. One night, my wife was dozed off on the couch watching a K-drama. All the lights in the house were off, and our son was already asleep in his room. I went to take a shower. When I came out, my wife had dozed off, still holding Daisy in her arms. I went to the kitchen to pack some food for work the next day. I didn't want to turn on the light so I wouldn't wake Daisy. While I was packing food, I glanced over at my wife and Daisy. I saw Daisy's eyes wide open, staring at me, smiling. I thought it might just be the TV light flickering, making it look like she was smiling at me, so I looked again. But she really was smiling at me. Smiling at Sissy on the living room. I felt a little creeped out, so I turned on the kitchen light and looked at Daisy again. This time, she was fast asleep. I figured I must have just imagined it in the dark. After I finished packing, I woke up my wife to go to bed, and I carried Daisy to her room. A few nights later, my wife wasn't feeling well. I told her to go to bed while I put our son down. Daisy was already asleep in her room. I put our baby boy to bed, but the moment I laid him down, he started crying and didn't want to be put down. As long as I held him, he'd fall asleep. While I was holding him and trying to get him to sleep, I noticed Daisy standing at the door to the room. I told her to go back to bed, and she did, But a couple of minutes later, she was back, standing at the door again, watching me rocking her baby brother to sleep. I told her to go back to bed, but this time she just stood there, staring at me. I told her 2 more times to go back to bed, but she didn't move. She just kept looking at me. When I finally put the baby down, I looked up and saw Daisy walking back to her room. I came out of the baby's room, closed the door, and followed her. When I opened the door to her room, she was already in bed, sound asleep. I turned on her nightlight and woke her up, asking if she had come to the baby's room. She said no. Feeling spooked, I told her to grab her blanket and come sleep with her mother and I in our room. I went to get the baby, and we all slept together that night. That house always felt strange. Even my wife said she felt like someone was watching her when she was home alone with the kids. After that night, I believed her, and I moved our family into a small apartment. I remember while we were moving out, Daisy asked why we didn't take Emma with us. I thought she was talking about her Snow White doll, so I said, "Emma's in your hand." She replied, "No, Daddy, this is Snow White." Right away, my wife said to Daisy, "Emma's mommy and daddy will come pick her up later, honey. Don't worry about Emma." Later, my wife told me she had also thought Daisy had named her Snow White doll Emma. That was so strange. Maybe a little girl named Emma had died in that house or something. Story number 4. There's a little town called Winton in Merced County. It's a dark and quiet place at night, but rather peaceful. I used to date a girl who lived in Winton, out in the countryside. Many families who live there also reside in the countryside. It's a little farm town. My girlfriend Lucy and her family had been living in their house for over 10 years. Her mother had passed away in that house. She had been sick for a long time. I wasn't sure what her illness was, but while I was dating Lucy, I learned that her mother had died in that very house. 2 years later, Lucy's father remarried, and her new stepmother brought 3 children with her to live with them. They became a big family, living and farming on the outskirts of Winton. A little background about Lucy's mother. When they were still in Thailand, Lucy's father was seeing other women, and her mother became extremely jealous. At one point, she attempted to poison herself. She fell into a coma, and people even said that she had died. But they brought in a grandmother to try and revive Lucy's mother. This grandma held Lucy's mother's hand and chanted in a strange language no one understood. After about 4 hours, Lucy's mother woke up. After that experience, Lucy's mother was what we called half human, half spirit. Because she had technically died once before, she remained sickly after that. When they came to the U.S., she had 2 more children, but afterwards she could no longer have kids. She eventually passed away. That's just a little history on Lucy's mother. I remember one early morning when I went to help Lucy's family getting ready for a religious ritual or ceremony. It was 6 a.m., and Lucy's father and 2 of her older brothers were outside, getting ready to butcher a pig. I was helping them set up in the garage. Suddenly, things on the shelves in the garage started falling to the floor, one by one. As I watched, I got goosebumps, and Lucy told me not to worry. It was just their mom. Deep down, that only made me more scared. But I guess Lucy and her siblings were so used to these occurrences that they weren't afraid anymore. I remember another day, around sunset, Lucy and I were sitting in the backyard, eating cucumbers and talking. On the right side of the yard, where they had tall corn and sugar cane, I kept seeing what looked like someone standing in the middle of the corn, watching us. I turned on the hot oven lights and lit the campfire, preparing for big dinner. I stared into the cornfield and could vaguely make out the figure of someone standing among the stalks. It was getting dark, so it was hard to tell, but I had a feeling it was Lucy's mother. Then Lucy's sister came out and asked her to help make dinner. We both got up, and Lucy went inside first. Before I entered the house, I turned back to look again, and this time I clearly saw someone squatting down behind the corn. I knew I wasn't imagining things. It had to be their mother. One late night after Lucy and I had gone to a movie, I dropped her off at home. I watched her open the door and go inside. As I backed up my car, I saw a woman in traditional funeral clothes standing on the left side of the house near the corner. Her face was obscured by banana tree leaves, but I knew what I saw. I just drove off. I loved Lucy a lot, and even today, I still think about her. But when I was dating her, I was always sick. I lived in Tulare, and I'd drive 2 hours to Winton to see her, but I never told my parents about what I had seen. They just thought I was sick, like everyone else. Shamanism is the religion of my family. Therefore, every year we would have a shaman perform a religious ritual to make sure that everything on the spirit side of things are good. When the shaman did the annual ritual, he encountered Lucy's mother on the spirit realm. The shaman wasn't aware that I was dating Lucy. He wasn't even aware about Lucy's mother. The shaman encountered Lucy's mother's spirit, and it turned out that her mother didn't want me visiting Lucy anymore. When my parents brought this up to me and asked if it's true, I told them everything I had seen and experienced. After that, I stopped going to see Lucy. I slowly stopped calling her. To this day, we never officially broke up. She never broke up with me, and I never broke up with her. We just don't call or talk to each other anymore, and after a while, we both moved on with our lives. Story number 5. My family and I used to live in a house off Girard Avenue. The other street nearby was Coffee Road. This was a long time ago, and that house has already been torn down, but the mailbox is still there when I drive by. Nowadays, it looks like they're turning that area into a shopping center. But back in 1991, there was a house there. It was out in the countryside, close to Highway 99. The house always smelled like cigarettes. My parents said maybe the family who lived there before us smoked inside. But the smell usually came from the vents. One night, I woke up to use the bathroom. As I looked towards the living room, I saw a middle-aged white woman with curly hair sitting there, and it looked like she was smoking a cigarette. She looked at me, then got up and started walking toward me. I got scared, ran back to my room, and completely forgot I needed to use the bathroom. I saw that woman a few times at night and told my parents about it, but I was just a kid, so they didn't believe me. Ever since we lived in that house, my mother always complained about having chest pains and feeling like something was sitting on her at night. It feels like a heavy sleep paralysis, according to my mother. In 1993, my mother passed away from a blood clot in her heart. After that, we moved out of the house. In 1995, one day, a man called our home phone and I answered. He asked to speak to my father, and so I hand over the phone to my father. I was watching TV in the living room, so I overheard their conversation, since my father was still doing something in the kitchen, and have the phone on speaker. The man said he and his family were living in our old house, and he asked if we had ever seen anything strange there. My father told him that I used to see a white woman with curly hair in the house, and that the man said his daughter didn't see a white woman. Instead, his daughter kept seeing an Asian woman with short hair about shoulder length. According to the man, his daughter kept seeing this Asian woman that's knitting by the window of the living room at night. I saw my dad's face turn pale. We both knew that the woman with short hair was my mother. The man also told my dad that his wife was experiencing the same thing my mother did, feeling like something was sitting on her at night, and she was now starting to have chest pains too. My father told him to get his family out of that house. That house was always so strange, but the house is no longer there. Story number 6. In my life, I keep remembering a time when I played at a cemetery with some kids. but it feels more like a dream than a real memory. I don't have any clear recollection of actually playing with kids at the cemetery, and even to this day, I don't know who those kids were. However, an event in my life makes me believe I might have gone somewhere with children who weren't from this world. In 1997, my family and I lived in a house on Child Avenue in Merced, California. Child Avenue is a road where one side has houses and the other side has a large cemetery. I was 4 or 5 years old at the time, the third child, with 2 older sisters. We loved watching cartoons and puppet shows on TV. As a child, I didn't know those puppets weren't real. So when I started seeing my teddy bear and my sister's dolls moving and talking, I thought it was normal since I saw dolls and animals talking on TV all the time, I often found myself playing with them in my room. One morning I woke up at what I thought was 6 a.m. I went to lay on the couch and tried to turn on some cartoons, but for some reason, there were no cartoons on, even though it was the same channel. I was the only one awake, and I lay there, drifting in and out of sleep. Then suddenly, my father hit me on the legs with his sandal and said, "Where have you been all day?" He continued hitting my legs, and I started crying. He kept hitting me until my mom came and stopped him. After I calmed down, my mom calmly asked, "Where have you been all day?" I told her I had just been sleeping and had just woken up. My mom looked at me, confused, and said it was already 6 p.m. I thought it was 6 a.m. I didn't know what had happened. I remembered going to bed the night before and waking up, but according to my family, I had been gone all day. They couldn't find me in my room or anywhere in the house. During the time I was missing, my family called my grandpa. My grandpa is a medicine man and a spiritual healer. He did a ritual and told my parents that I was still around the house, but for some reason, they couldn't see me that weekend. My grandpa performed another ritual and said that I had been hidden by some children in our house. My mom held the two together, watching them as they neared with great concern. My grandpa also said that the children have taken me to go and play at the cemetery during the time that I was gone. He advised us to move out because living across from the cemetery wasn't good. 2 months later, we moved out of that house. Child Avenue is a strange street, but there are so many accidents there. And often, the people involved in those accidents end up dead. Story number 7. My family and I used to live in a house by the train tracks, close to Hoover Middle School. We lived near the area where a woman committed suicide by standing in the middle of the train track. That area always felt strange. On one side of the train tracks, there were brand new houses. On the other side, there were older houses with large backyards. We lived in one of the old houses. Living next to us was a very nice elderly white lady. Her house was at a T intersection with 3 stop signs. We never saw anyone visit her. In her backyard, there were several trees, with a cherry tree in the middle. During the first 3 years we lived there, every spring she would let us go to her backyard to pick cherries, because if left unpicked, they wouldn't last long on the tree. In the 4th year, when spring came, her cherries were already turning red, with some even blackening on the tree. Some had fallen onto the grass. Even my mother wondered why the elderly lady hadn't come to tell us to pick the cherries that year. From our backyard, we could see the ripe cherries, some on the tree and others already on the ground. One day, my parents were in our backyard, watering their herbs. We kids were out there too. My parents commented on a strong smell, like a dead animal nearby. They started talking about the odor and the fact that we hadn't seen the old lady for many days. Curious, my father climbed the fence to look into the lady's yard. He saw a lot of flies at her kitchen window. He told my mother that something seemed off. After they finished watering the herbs, my father asked me to go with him to knock on the old lady's door. We knocked, but there was no answer. My father looked through the window, and as a car passed by and its headlights shone, he saw the old lady in a white gown standing in the dark hallway. Her hair was messy, and she was staring back at him. My father got scared and said we should go home and call 911. We went back, and I called 911 since my father don't speak English. I called, and explaining that we hadn't seen our neighbor for a while, and there was a strange smell coming from her house. About 5 minutes later, a police officer arrived. My family was outside, and my father went with the officer to check on the house. The officer was able to open the door, and together they went inside. The smell was overwhelming, with flies everywhere. They found the old lady in her bedroom. She was still alive, but unable to move. However, she was delirious and not making any sense. Her right leg was severely rotted, her skin was dry, and she was dehydrated. An ambulance arrived and took her to the hospital, where she later died from very high blood sugar and septic shock. According to the report, there was no break-in or foul play. They believe she had cut her toenails and accidentally nicked her skin. Due to her high blood sugar, the wound didn't heal and became infected, causing her leg to rot. After her death, 2 Mexican families moved into the house, but each only stayed for a few weeks. Eventually, the house was fenced off and the windows boarded up. It remained that way for 2 years before someone bought and remodeled it. We don't know if the house is haunted, as we had moved to Atwater. Story number 8. We used to live in one of those old houses near the Merced DMV. I had a friend named Cha. Cha had both a Super Nintendo and a Sega Genesis gaming system, along with a lot of games. The games I really wanted were Mortal Kombat and Killer Instinct, but I didn't have either. One day, Cha's grandpa passed away in their house. He had been sick for a long time and was blind. At that time, the funeral home in Merced didn't allow overnight stays, though I'm not sure if it's the same now. On the first day of the funeral, I was there with Cha and our friends. I remember seeing Cha's father recording the funeral on his camcorder, planning to send the video to his younger brother in Thailand. The funeral home closed at 9 p.m., so we all left and returned home. They reopened it the next morning at 7 a.m. On the second day, I was at the funeral again. Cha and his whole family were there, so I knew no one was home. Around 6 p.m., as the sun was setting, I knew the funeral home would be closing soon, and it was time for me to head home. Instead, I drove to Cha's house and snuck into their backyard. I opened a window, climbed up on the AC unit, and got inside through Cha's sister's room. From there, I went into Cha and his little brother's room, where most of their games were kept. Cha's 2 game systems were in the living room with the TV, but most of the games were in their room. They had a lot of games, so as I was going through them to see which ones I wanted to, I suddenly heard the TV turn on in the living room. The sound coming from the TV was from the funeral. It was filled with crying, mourning, and the sound some funeral instruments were heard. I thought they had come home early, so I hid under the bed and peeked out the door. After a while, I realized I could still hear the TV, but I didn't hear anything else. No footsteps, no voices. I didn't see anyone walk past the door either. I figured there was no way Cha's family could have gotten home that quickly. I went back to looking for the games and grabbed a few, but I couldn't find Mortal Kombat or Killer Instinct. I thought maybe those games were in the living room where the TV was still playing the funeral video. The house was getting dark, except for the light coming from the living room where the TV was on. I quietly walked down the hallway and peeked into the living room. That's when I saw Cha's grandpa sitting on the sofa watching his own funeral on TV. What the freak? How was he watching TV if he was blind? I could see his white, cloudy eyes blinking, and he was watching his own funeral. I was terrified. I ran back to Cha's sister's room, climbed out the window, and went straight home. Maybe he didn't realize he was dead, and that's why he was still in the house, even though his funeral was happening at the funeral home. That's all for this video. Thank you for making all the way through and supporting my stories. Have a wonderful day or night.